Releasing games unfinished. I hate it. It's basically an industry standard nowadays, and this is especially true for Nintendo, who have now released a slew of games that people claim aren't fully completed. Now, do I agree with this sentiment? I mean, I wrote the script, what do you think? While I may not fully think that a bunch of these games that people say are incomplete are truly incomplete and unfinished, they are lacking a lot of content in some regard. But who am I to judge? I can actually relate to this. There's a bunch of job applications that I haven't even finished yet, and I'll never do them. Now, this sentiment of games being released unfinished or incomplete has only grown stronger as technology continues to advance. Games are becoming more and more expensive to make, and they're taking longer to produce because of the more complex hardware. Making a modern video game is complicated. It's like going grocery shopping in a library. Especially once we headed over into 3D, game development has become much more harder than it's ever been before. Back in the day, it wouldn't take very long to make your basic or average arcade or Atari game. The original Pac-Man game was made in about a year and a couple of months, and at that time, that was considered extremely long for a video game. This isn't to say that games back in the 70s and 80s didn't need extra development time. I mean, there's E.T. But you can think of it like school. The higher the grade level, the more work you have to do. The more work I have to do, the more I'm gonna hire someone else to do it for me. And also cheat. And that's basically what's been happening to video games lately. Game companies aren't getting smaller, oh no, they're pretty much expanding to become as big as possible. And who can blame them? There's so much work that needs to be done in order to get a successful video game off the ground. In the early years of video games, you could have like 10 people in a ham sandwich create a masterpiece. But as time started to progress and as the demand for more advanced video games began to increase, the scope of game development began to as well. The original Super Mario Bros. Was programmed by 7 people. Fast forward to Super Mario Bros. 3, and this rose to 11 people. Now heading into 1996, Super Mario 64 had around 15 to 20 people working on it. No longer were games these projects that these guys could work on and chip away at during their lunchtime. No. These needed full-on production teams. And with modern video games, there's so many things that developers have to worry about. Of course, there's the ever-prevalent bugs and glitches, but nowadays, there's lighting, physics, frame rate, loading times, audio, cutscenes, art production, and modeling, and online servers. That's a lot of stuff that video game developers have to worry about. And that's just the development side. There's tons of stuff when it comes to budgeting the game, schedules, and internal structure. To take another look at it, video games is probably one of the hardest mediums to work in. One program messing up can be a death sentence for the entire game. Messing up one thing in one area can screw up an entire game development. I mean, how many games do we know of that has 1 or 2 major glaring issues that pretty much ruins the entire game for us? That's kind of like me. I'd be the perfect person if I didn't have asthma. Nowadays, there's hundreds of people working on one game. It's a ginormous collaborative effort. It goes without saying, making these modern AAA games aren't an easy feat. Everyone has to be on the same page. But also, creating a game from scratch can take a very, very long time to develop. And from coming up with a concept to level designing to releasing the game once it's finished, it's so much work. Now, with all this being said, Jesus Christ, why does this game suck? In this current landscape of do now, finish later in gaming, it seems that a lot of the games that Nintendo's been releasing lately have felt a bit half-baked. If you look at the discussions around them, there's tons of people saying that the latest Nintendo games, especially the Mario Sports games, have felt unfinished. But it's starting to be a bit more widespread, especially when you consider the different amount of developers that Nintendo works with. And this is a pretty big issue, as gamers are starting to feel a bit jaded by the constant release of unpolished games. And honestly, I won't lie and say I'm not a bit hesitant when I see a Nintendo game be announced. There's always this thought in the back of my head that says, yeah, while the game seems cool and all the content be there on release? Is there going to be a lack of fun modes in this game? Will it make me more depressed? Of course, these feelings aren't around for the big AAA releases, mostly the smaller budget AA games. These feelings can be summed up to what I like to call them, the unfinished syndrome, or what my doctor calls being cheap. It's the fear of spending $60 on a game that isn't fully completed and not getting your money's worth. But why is this an issue? Why does it feel as if Nintendo's releasing games unfinished? If you ask me, I don't think these games are unfinished, more so that they're just missing out on their true potential. Like me in college. With the Switch generation of games, the discussion has become a bit more prevalent as it's one of the more popular Nintendo consoles. But I'd say that this issue has started to creep its way in even earlier than that. Technically, there's always been games that lack content. For as much as I love the original Super Mario Strikers, it's always been devoid of fun modes to play, especially when compared to other Mario Sports games at the time. Does this mean that the developers are lazy? Of course not. But it's something that's always been relevant, even in first-party games. And we're talking about the early to mid-2000s here, back when there was no updating your games and receiving the newest DLC. Once you released your game to the public, there was no turning back or saying, wait, let's patch this in. No, once it's out there, it's permanently out there. But that's why God invented something called sequels. If your game was lacking in modes or content or cut gameplay, back then you could just make a new one. For every NBA 2K3, there's a 2K4. There's enough Need for Speed games to feed an entire country. You can just use the same assets and then charge $50 again, and then include all the cut content from before. But with the internet now being available to more people than ever, this isn't really needed anymore. I mean, why spend an entire development cycle making a new game and then charging $60 when you can take a quarter of the content out of the game and then charge $30 for downloadable content instead? But Nintendo is a bit different. Instead of normally charging people, they tend to do free updates. They'll launch the base game with some content included, and then eventually they'll drop updates throughout the game's life. I mean, imagine ordering food and over time the chef puts all the ingredients onto your plates. I'm happy to have food, but I would have preferred to have it all here at the same time. The thing about these free updates is that the base game feels lacking. Instead of there being fun modes or characters to play with, you're stuck with a launch game that's missing everything. And on top of that, you just paid full price for the game. The expectation of games in modern times has pretty much shifted. Gamers are kind of demanding more out of their games. Yeah, while older titles may have lacked content, it was just a different time period for games altogether. On top of that, paying full price for a game for a lot of people is a big ask, especially me, because I'm broke. And with consoles being expensive, controllers costing an arm and a leg, and paying for online services, I get that gaming is a luxury, but this also means that people are going to be a bit more aware of what they're going to purchase. Because why would I spend money on Dongo's Adventure instead of, food? Nintendo updating their games over time also helps out with the game's shelf life. Releasing a game with a small amount of characters at launch and over time dropping new characters and costumes every month or so, that means that the game is going to have these short bursts of popularity again. It gets people talking about the game and it stays in people's minds. And sure, you may not talk about the game for months on end, but you talked about it, and that's way better than not talking about it at all. Releasing these new games undercooked and slowly dropping new updates, there's a reason to promote it more. Imagine trying to promote Mario Tennis Aces a year after its launch. You'll look stupid and desperate. But if you're releasing a new character for the game, then it works perfectly fine. But you still look stupid and desperate. But overall, it's a win-win. The people that enjoy the game will pick it up and play it again, and hopefully with more spotlight on the game again, it'll increase sales. However, this is still a big problem, especially when it comes to replay value. There's just been a bunch of times when I've waited patiently for a game, played it at launch, and after a week or so of playing the game, I realized there's nothing pulling me back to play it again. And that's crazy, because I'm a nerd with no life. A lot of the time, the updates that these games receive are minimal and aren't substantial enough for me to be pulled back in. Just like the salary on these job applications. And sure, while it's not out of the ordinary or unusual to slowly add characters to your game's roster via updates, the way Nintendo is doing it, it seems like they're purposely taking out content from the game, only to seem generous when they put it back in for free. It's like taking somebody out on a date, but you're using coupons. Look, Mario Tennis Aces had 16 characters at launch in 2018, and by the end of 2019, that number bumped up to 30. But could you imagine the initial hype with there being 30 characters at launch? Sometimes that initial reception, the positive press that a game gets when it first comes out, does better for its shelf life than putting out new characters here and there for a year straight. But updating the game via updates is fine and all, but what's gonna happen in the future, 10 years from now when people try to play these games? Will there still be services available for people to get all the updates for these games? Or are they gonna launch a Game of the Year edition with all the missing content? If not, these games are gonna age pretty poorly. It goes to my point I made before. Once a game is out there, it's out there permanently. So 15 years from now, when someone puts in Mario Strikers Battle League, that roster of 10 characters is the permanent roster. But when someone puts in Nintendo Switch Sports, the added modes in sports won't be there. Yeah, you're giving us content now, but what about the legacy of your game in the future? These in-the-moment updates will only work for so long. We can't have these servers going on forever, so releasing these games half-baked and slowly drip-feeding content out is only making the problem worse. Remember when ARMS released with like 10 characters at launch? Of course you do. That was purgatory. Now of course, it isn't every first-party Nintendo game. There's a tons of games that Nintendo releases that's just oozing with content. Breath of the Wild, Luigi's Mansions, and the Xenoblade series are really enjoyable games, and Nintendo and their various developers can still put out some of the greatest games of all time. They're still more talented than me. But what bothers most people is what Nintendo does with their other mid-tier budget games, your Switch Sports, Tennis Aces, and Super Rush. It's the over-reliance on DLC, and I get that these games are really simple games, and it's just sports. I mean, what else can you do with them? But then you look at the older titles and see how much content is pushed into it. and then you get jealous. But this isn't really a Nintendo issue, as it's more of a widespread issue in gaming as a whole. There's tons of AAA games being released now that's lacking in content and with paid DLC. Battlefield 5, it came out with bugs and was lacking in gameplay features that the past entries had. Halo Infinite felt rushed at launch and had a feeling of being incomplete. And that's at least one thing I can give Nintendo a point on, is that they never released a game with game-breaking bugs that makes it unplayable. It's just that the games feel like they're missing a lot of content, but at the end of the day, they're at least playable. And this is the more frustrating part. None of the games that people claim are unfinished by Nintendo aren't bad at all. In fact, they're very well made and can still be a really fun time. It's just that they lack so much and other stuff to do that it makes it really hard to play them again. Now, there are certain games that I looked at and I don't necessarily qualify them as unfinished. I just think that the game would benefit more with more time in development. A big example of this would be Pokemon Legends Arceus, which if you ask me, it needs a bit more time in the oven. This isn't a bad game per se, but the graphics definitely needed some more time in the oven. And I'm not a stickler for visuals, but I have a feeling that this game was released by anybody else, it would have been criticized fairly. Again, this game isn't really incomplete or unfinished, it just needed more time to be polished. Okay, so the Sword and Shield. It's like someone offering you chicken, but it's still raw and alive. Just knowing that certain games lack content makes me a bit hesitant to pick them up. As excited as I was for Mario Party Superstars, I'm not gonna act as if I wasn't a bit unsure on whether I'd pick it up on the first day or not. And these feelings are pretty much justified when you look at past Nintendo games getting content later in its life. The previous Mario Party game, Super Mario Party, while an amazing return to form and a pretty good time, it didn't have a full online multiplayer experience at launch. It wasn't until another 3 years that it was finally updated with it. Obviously, it was added as a test run for the upcoming Mario Party Superstars, but why wasn't it already in the game and in development from the jump? Mario Golf Super Rush looked to be a really incredible time before its release, with there being speed golf and a return of the story mode from previous entries. But once the game came out, it started to feel bare bones with a lacking roster and a lackluster gameplay. Sure, new content was released thereafter, but that first impression is what really matters to most gamers. Knowing content is coming is fine and all, but that first impression, the very first time you play a game, it leaves a much larger impact on you. There's been plenty of times when a game has momentum, but upon release, the game loses steam because it wasn't able to meet its own standards. This hurts the game's life more than anything. No matter how much DLC you add to the game, once it's left a bad taste in the consumer's mouth, it'll stick more than anything else. Kinda like this sandwich. I don't think Nintendo's making games that are particularly bad either. For as much as Nintendo Switch Sports should have been developed a bit longer before releasing it in its current state, it's not in the same boat as your generic sports game. Hey, the day a Nintendo sports game looks like Instant Sports Paradise, it's the day I give up on life. There's still a level of quality to the games that Nintendo releases, it's just that they oftentimes feel a bit barren to play over a period of time. But I won't lie and say that I'm not worried about their future. That's the same thing that my mom told me. I have a small feeling that this could be how Nintendo handles most of their games well into the future. There's also the fact that these games come from different developers. I just find it so odd that Camelot, a company that's been responsible for some of the best Mario Sports games, has kind of been missing the mark when it comes to their latest outings. Especially when you consider the fact that some of the people that worked on the previous Mario Sports games for the company are still working there today. And of course, there could be internal stuff going on that we don't know about. But I do find it kinda odd that their newer games aren't hitting the same strides as their older ones. That's like forgetting how to cook. The guys over at Nintendo EPD have put out some of the best games of this generation, and Tank Troopers. But at the same time, they came out with Nintendo Switch Sports, a game with middling reception. Next Level Games is incredibly talented. You can't get mad at the guys that made Cybertron Adventures, but Mario Strikers Battle League lacks more content than I do character. The developers obviously know how to make amazing games, but the formula of release now, finish later hurts them more than they think, especially in the eyes of fans. I also think that these games feel a bit rushed because Nintendo has sort of entered a new territory with the Switch. I don't think Nintendo has had a home console with this much success before in a very long time. Sure, while the Wii did amazing numbers, its longevity was very short-lived and its popularity was during its early years. We're 5 years in with the Switch, and unlike me in real life, it's only become more popular as time goes on. Nintendo wants to capitalize on the insane success of the Switch as much as possible and as fast as possible. I think that's why these games are being released so undercooked. There's a reason why the Wii U's library was so barren. Why would you spend money developing games on a console that's dead? During the Wii U era, Satoru Iwata actually had to apologize for the lack of games on the Wii U. People were acting like it was a famine. Because it was! For as much as I love the GameCube, it didn't sell amazingly well compared to its competitors. But Nintendo's output when it came to games on the system was incredible, and there's a wide variety of different series represented on the console. But even with all the different games on the system, it still didn't manage to be as successful as Nintendo wanted it to be. I think Nintendo realized that there has to be a balance of both, a wide selling system and a large output of games in order to have the best of both worlds. I think this explains their output on the Switch, and it goes without saying, each development cycle is understandably different for every game. The development cycle for Wii Sports and Wii Party probably wasn't the same for Skyward Sword or Super Mario Galaxy. The Switch just has a much more larger audience, so it's more people to reach, and of course, money! But I think that hurts Nintendo even more, because yeah, while people like me know that Nintendo's capable of making much better games, for a lot of people, this is going to be their first introduction to Nintendo. Millions of people are going to get their first experience with Nintendo with these undercooked games, and that's going to leave a bad impression on millions of people. Could you imagine if your first introduction to games was Switch Sports? I'd rather it be Scrabble. All of this isn't to say that Nintendo games aren't finished or that this is a case of highway robbery, more so that Nintendo and the developers should rethink how they release their games at launch. The games feel great to play, but the amount of stuff missing for these core Nintendo IPs is pretty shocking. The same care that they put in for their AAA budget titles should be used for their lower tier of games as well. There is a feeling of them being rushed, but wouldn't they rather take a bit longer to work on these games and make it as enjoyable as possible? Because when I look at these games, I don't see a quote-unquote bad game, just a game that's missing its mark to be something better. These games aren't unfinished. They're just missing their true potential. Oh yeah, I was gonna add a joke here, but I totally forgot it. But don't worry, I'm gonna come back later with an update and then finish it.